My name is Robert Mitchell, and I'm 58 years old. 25 years ago, I held my newborn daughter Sarah in my arms and promised her the world. I worked double shifts at the steel mill, missed countless meals, and sacrificed everything so she could have the life I never did. Last Saturday, I stood outside St. Mary's Church in my best suit, watching through stained glass windows as Sarah walked down the aisle. But when I tried to enter, she looked me straight in the eyes and said those words that shattered my heart forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear how this day changed everything I thought I knew about family sacrifice and finding peace when the people you love most decide you don't matter anymore. It was spring of 1997 when I married Dolores in a small ceremony at the courthouse downtown. We couldn't afford anything fancy, but we were young and full of dreams. I was 28 working at Morrison Steel Mill, pulling in decent money, but nothing extravagant. Dolores worked part-time at the local bank, and we lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street that I'd bought with every penny I'd saved since high school. When Sarah was born the following spring, everything changed. The moment the nurse placed that tiny bundle in my arms, I felt a love so fierce it took my breath away. Her perfect little fingers wrapped around mine, and I whispered a promise that would define the next 2 decades of my life. I swore she would never want for anything, never struggle the way I had growing up in a trailer park with a father who drank away every paycheck. That promise drove me to work harder than I ever had. The steel mill offered overtime, and I took every hour they'd give me. 60-hour weeks became my normal, sometimes 70, when they needed extra hands on the weekend shifts. The work was brutal, hot, dangerous, but the overtime pay meant Sarah could have things other kids had. Piano lessons at $8 a week, dance classes at the community center, books, toys, clothes that weren't hand-me-downs. By the time Sarah turned 5, the cracks in my marriage were starting to show. Dolores complained constantly about my absence. She'd started joining a book club with women from the wealthier neighborhoods, and I could see the envy in her eyes when they talked about their husbands' careers, their vacation homes, their children's private schools. The arguments became a weekly ritual. She'd accuse me of caring more about work than family, and I'd try to explain that everything I did was for them. But how do you explain exhaustion to someone who's never worked a 16-hour shift? How do you justify missing dinner when you're trying to ensure your family never goes hungry? I remember the night I found the credit card statements hidden in her jewelry box. Expensive purchases from department stores I'd never heard of. Jewelry, clothes, home decorations. When I confronted her, she exploded, saying she deserved nice things too, that she was tired of living like we were poor, when other families had so much more. That's when I took the night security job at the warehouse district. 40 hours a week, guarding empty buildings from midnight to 8 in the morning, then home for 3 hours of sleep before my shift at the mill. The extra $300 a week would cover Dolores's spending and still leave something for Sarah's college fund. Sarah was 7 when I had to sell my 1987 Mustang. It was the only thing I'd ever owned that was truly mine, bought and paid for before I met Dolores. But Sarah had shown interest in piano, and lessons at the music academy cost $200 a month. The Mustang brought in $4,000, enough to cover a year of lessons and buy her a used upright piano for practice. I'll never forget her face when I surprised her with that piano on her 8th birthday. She threw her arms around my neck and told me I was the best daddy in the world. It was worth every sacrifice. But Dolores's friend Gladys was already planting poison seeds. I'd overhear their conversations sometimes, Gladys asking why Robert was never at school events, why he missed so many family dinners, whether Dolores ever felt like a single mother. The questions were innocent enough, but they fed Dolores's growing resentment. Sarah started asking those same questions. Why was Daddy always working? Why couldn't he come to her dance recitals like other fathers? I'd show up exhausted sometimes, still in my work clothes, because I'd driven straight from the mill, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Other fathers wore suits and ties. Other fathers looked fresh and relaxed. I looked like exactly what I was, a man who'd been working since dawn to pay for his daughter's dreams. The rare Sundays when I wasn't working overtime became precious. I'd take Sarah fishing at Lake Winnebago, just the two of us in my little aluminum boat. Those were the moments when she was mine again, when the world narrowed down to just a father and daughter, casting lines into the dark water, talking about everything and nothing. She'd tell me about school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, or maybe a teacher. But even those moments were tainted by Dolores's disapproval when we returned home. Sarah would excitedly tell her mother about the fish we'd caught, and Dolores would respond with comments about how Sarah's hair smelled like lake water, or how she'd gotten her clothes dirty. The joy would drain from Sarah's face, and I'd watch my daughter learn to hide her happiness about our time together. By the time Sarah entered her teenage years, the foundation of our family had developed cracks too wide to ignore. She'd been accepted to Brookfield Academy, a prestigious private school, where tuition ran $15,000 a year. It was Sarah's dream, and Dolores insisted we couldn't disappoint her. I took on a third job, weekend landscaping work, that left my hands raw and my back screaming. At parent meetings, I'd arrive in work clothes because I'd driven straight from whatever job I'd been working. Other fathers wore expensive suits and drove luxury cars. I wore steel-toed boots and drove a 10-year-old pickup truck with rust spots on the fenders. Sarah would introduce me to her friends with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The breaking point came during Sarah's sophomore year, when Dolores issued her ultimatum. We were sitting at the kitchen table after another argument about money, about time, about everything that had gone wrong between us. "Choose," she said, her voice cold and final. "Choose your family or your work schedule. You can't have both." It was an impossible demand. If I cut back my hours, we'd lose the house within 6 months. Sarah would have to leave Brookfield Academy, and college would become a distant dream. But if I kept working, I'd continue to be the absent father Dolores accused me of being. I tried to compromise. I dropped the weekend landscaping job and cut back to 50 hours at the mill. Within 2 months, we'd missed our first mortgage payment. The bank's warning notices arrived in thick manila envelopes that Dolores left unopened on the counter like accusations. Then I discovered what had happened to Sarah's college fund. $23,000 I'd saved over 12 years gone. Dolores had spent it on a kitchen renovation, claiming the house needed updating if we ever wanted to sell it. The granite countertops and stainless steel appliances mocked me every morning as I grabbed coffee before my pre-dawn shift. Our fight that night was epic. Neighbors called the police thinking someone was being murdered. Sarah heard every word, including when I told Dolores she'd stolen our daughter's future for backsplash tiles and cabinet hardware. The next morning, Sarah wouldn't speak to me. In her 15-year-old mind, I was the one who'd caused the fighting, the one who'd made Mommy cry. 6 months later, Dolores moved out. She'd been having an affair with Dr. Harrison, a surgeon she'd met at the country club, where she'd somehow managed to get a membership, despite our financial struggles. The divorce papers were served to me at the mill in front of my coworkers by a process server who seemed to enjoy the humiliation. During the custody hearings, Dolores's expensive lawyer painted me as an absentee father who cared more about overtime pay than his daughter's emotional needs. My overworked public defender did his best, but the truth was hard to argue against. I had worked too much. I had missed too many school events. I had been absent for too many important moments. Sarah's testimony was the knife that finished the job. Standing before the judge in a dress I'd never seen before, she quietly testified that she'd prefer to live with her mother. She felt more comfortable there, she said. Her father was always working, and when he was home, he was usually tired or arguing with mommy about money. I got every other weekend, alternating holidays, and 2 weeks each summer. Watching my daughter walk out of that courtroom holding her mother's hand, I felt something die inside me that I didn't think would ever come back to life. The house on Maple Street became a mausoleum. Sarah's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it. Her stuffed animals arranged on the bed, her books lined up on the shelves, her childhood drawings still taped to the mirror. I'd sit in there sometimes after particularly brutal days at the mill, surrounded by the evidence of the little girl who used to think I was the best daddy in the world. The drinking started slowly. A beer after work became 2, then 3. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in Sarah's doorway at 2 in the morning, holding a photograph from her 8th birthday party, the one where she's hugging me so tight her feet are off the ground. I'd made her so happy then. How had it all gone so wrong? I made myself a new promise in that empty house. Whatever it took, however long it took, I would win back my daughter's love. I would prove that every sacrifice had been for her, that every missed dinner and every exhausted weekend had been my way of showing how much she meant to me. I would make her understand that a father's love isn't always measured in presence. Sometimes it's measured in the willingness to be absent, so your child can have everything you never did. The reconciliation years began with forced enthusiasm and ended with quiet desperation. Every other Friday evening, I'd pick Sarah up from Dolores's new house in the suburbs, a sprawling colonial with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. Dr. Harrison had clearly provided the life I never could. Sarah would slide into my pickup truck with the polite smile she'd perfected, the one that said she was fulfilling an obligation rather than spending time with someone she loved. Our weekends together became performances where we both pretended things were normal. I took her to expensive restaurants. I couldn't afford places where she felt comfortable, and I felt like an imposter. She'd order confidently from menus I had to study, like foreign language textbooks discussing wine pairings and appetizer selections, with a sophistication that reminded me how far apart our worlds had grown. When Sarah turned 16, I bought her first car, a used Honda Civic with 40,000 miles and a small dent in the rear bumper, but it was reliable and safe. I'd traded in my truck and taken out a loan to make up the difference. For one brief moment, when I handed her the keys, I saw a flash of the little girl who used to get excited about birthday presents. But it faded quickly when she realized her friends at Brookfield Academy drove BMWs and Mercedes. High school graduation was bittersweet torture. I sat in the audience watching my daughter give the valedictorian speech, speaking eloquently about perseverance and following your dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd learned about perseverance from watching her father work himself into the ground, but she'd somehow concluded that my perseverance was a character flaw rather than a virtue. College selection became another battlefield I lost before the war began. Sarah chose Northwestern University, one of the most expensive schools in the country. The tuition room and board would cost more in 4 years than I'd made in the previous 8. But she'd been accepted, and Dolores insisted we couldn't hold back our daughter's potential because of financial limitations. I took a 4th job delivering pizza 3 nights a week. Driving around town at 58 years old, wearing a uniform with a cartoon mascot, delivering food to families who looked at me like I was invisible. Sometimes I delivered to neighborhoods where Sarah's friends lived, and I'd pray they wouldn't recognize me. The house on Maple Street had to go. 20 years of memories, 20 years of mortgage payments sold to cover 2 years of Sarah's college expenses. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the sound of washing machines and dryers providing a constant industrial lullaby that reminded me of the steel mill. Sarah's phone calls became increasingly rare and increasingly brief. Usually they followed a pattern: a few minutes of polite conversation about classes and weather, then a casual mention of some expense. Books cost more than expected. Her laptop had crashed and needed replacing. Spring break was coming up and all her friends were going somewhere exotic. I said yes every time, even when it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and dinner, even when it meant my electricity got shut off for 2 weeks, because I'd sent the money to Sarah instead of the power company. Her junior year, she spent spring break at Dr. Harrison's lake house instead of visiting me. She called to tell me about the skiing and the boat trips with her friends, describing a life of casual luxury that sounded as foreign to me as a fairy tale. I listened and made encouraging sounds while staring at my empty refrigerator and wondering if I had enough gas in my car to deliver pizzas that night. College graduation was the cruelest blow yet. I'd been looking forward to it for months, marking the date on my calendar, taking time off from all my jobs. I bought a new suit, the first one I'd owned in 15 years, spending money I didn't have because I wanted to look like a father Sarah could be proud of. The tickets were limited, she explained in a phone call 2 days before the ceremony. Mom and Dr. Harrison were coming, of course, and Grandma Dolores and some family friends who'd been so supportive during college. There just wasn't room for everyone. I drove to Northwestern anyway. I stood outside the auditorium listening to the ceremony through the brick walls, hearing Sarah's name called when she received her degree, summa cum laude. When the ceremony ended and families poured out celebrating, Sarah saw me waiting by the entrance. She gave me a quick hug that felt obligatory, posed for one photograph that someone else took, then disappeared into a crowd of people I didn't recognize. That night in my hotel room, I looked at the single photograph on my phone. Sarah smiling her polite smile, standing next to a man who looked older and more tired than he should have. It took me a moment to realize I was looking at myself. Sarah landed a prestigious marketing position at a firm in Chicago, starting at more money than I'd ever made in my best year. She moved into a downtown apartment that cost more per month than my entire annual income from the mill. During our rare conversations, she'd mention restaurants, concerts, vacations with casual indifference that highlighted how completely our worlds had diverged. The depression crept in slowly, like water seeping through a foundation crack. Some days I'd wake up and wonder why I bothered getting out of bed. The jobs that had once given me purpose now felt meaningless. I wasn't building anything anymore, wasn't providing for anyone who needed me. I was just going through motions, filling time until time ran out. The wedding announcement arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered to my apartment in an expensive cream-colored envelope with Sarah's initials embossed in gold. For a moment, holding that elegant invitation, I felt a surge of joy so pure it took me back to the day she was born. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was marrying Thomas Vandenberg on November 15th at St. Mary's Cathedral. The reception would follow at the Riverside Country Club. Black tie requested. Thomas Vandenberg. I'd heard the name but didn't immediately place it. A quick internet search revealed he was heir to Vandenberg Construction, one of the largest commercial building companies in the Midwest. His family owned hotels, shopping centers, office complexes, the kind of generational wealth that made my lifetime of savings look like pocket change. I was genuinely happy for Sarah. She'd found someone who could give her the life she deserved, the life I'd always wanted to provide but never could. Maybe Thomas would understand her in ways I never had. Maybe he'd be the father to their future children that I'd somehow failed to be to her. The dinner meeting was arranged through Sarah, a getting-to-know-you evening at Morton's Steakhouse downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early wearing my graduation suit and feeling underdressed despite having spent an hour getting ready. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place I'd taken Sarah on our forced weekend outings, all dark wood and leather and prices that made my wallet ache. Thomas was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd hoped for. Tall, handsome, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He had the easy confidence of someone who'd never worried about money, never worked a job where his hands got dirty, never made a decision based on what he could afford rather than what he wanted. He was polite enough asking questions about my work and my life, with the same practiced interest he might show discussing the weather with a stranger in an elevator. But I could see in his eyes that he was already categorizing me, filing me away in some mental folder labeled Unfortunate Family Connections. Sarah glowed next to him, radiant in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. She talked about wedding plans with an excitement that reminded me of the little girl who used to get thrilled about Christmas morning. But when she looked at me, that excitement dimmed slightly, as if my presence somehow diminished the perfection of her new life. The engagement party happened at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where their wedding reception would be held. My invitation arrived 2 days beforehand, which felt deliberate. Long enough to maintain plausible politeness, short enough to ensure I couldn't make proper preparations. I took a day off from the mill and spent my last $200 on clothes that would help me blend into Sarah's new world. The country club was intimidating in its casual elegance, the kind of place where wealth was displayed through understatement rather than ostentation. Dolores held court at the center of the room, surrounded by women whose names I recognized from years of overhearing phone conversations. Phyllis, Janet, Evelyn, all of them dressed in clothes that cost more than my monthly salary, all of them treating me with the polite coldness reserved for unwelcome guests. I tried to mingle, but every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. When people asked what I did for work, I could see their expressions change when I mentioned the steel mill. When they asked where I lived, the apartment above the laundromat didn't impress anyone. I spent most of the evening standing by the windows, watching Sarah laugh with people I didn't know, feeling like a stranger at my own daughter's celebration. The whispers weren't exactly subtle. That's Sarah's father, the one who was never around. Poor Sarah having to deal with that side of the family. At least she's marrying up. Wedding planning became another exercise in exclusion. Sarah would mention details in passing during our monthly phone calls, but always with the assumption that I was receiving information rather than being consulted. The flowers were white roses and baby's breath. The photographer was someone famous whose name I didn't recognize. The band played jazz standards that would complement the country club's sophisticated atmosphere. My offers to help were politely declined or simply ignored. When I suggested contributing to the cost, Sarah assured me that Thomas's family had everything covered. When I asked about the rehearsal dinner, she mentioned it would be small and intimate, just immediate family and the wedding party. It slowly dawned on me that immediate family didn't include me. The realization hit fully when wedding invitations began arriving at houses throughout the city, elegant affairs that matched Sarah's engagement announcement. I waited through October and into November, checking my mailbox with the desperation of a man waiting for lottery results. The confirmation came accidentally through Dolores's friend Connie, who mentioned seeing me at the engagement party and asked if I was excited about the ceremony at St. Mary's. When I admitted I hadn't received my invitation yet, her face went through a series of expressions that told me everything I needed to know. There was no invitation coming. My daughter was getting married, and I wasn't invited to her wedding. The steel mill's employee assistance program included 3 sessions with a counselor, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who specialized in family issues. I told her about the wedding, about the years of sacrifice and gradual estrangement, about the growing certainty that I'd somehow lost my daughter forever. "What do you want to do?" she asked during our final session. "I want to be her father," I said. "I want to walk her down the aisle and dance with her at the reception and embarrass her with a speech about how proud I am. I want her to know that every single day I worked 2 jobs and 3 jobs and 4 jobs, I was thinking about her. I was doing it for her. And if she doesn't want you there?" I thought about that question for a long time. "Then I want to at least try. Fathers belong at their daughters' weddings. If she tells me to leave, I'll leave. But I have to try." November 15th dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect autumn mornings where the light seems to transform everything it touches into something magical. I'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to do anything but pace around my small apartment, rehearsing what I might say when I saw Sarah. The drive to St. Mary's Cathedral took 45 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more elegant. The church itself was a Gothic masterpiece, all soaring spires and stained glass windows that caught the morning sun like jewels. Wedding guests were already arriving when I parked 3 blocks away, not wanting to take up space that might be reserved for people who actually belonged there. I'd spent my last $150 on a boutonniere from the florist shop near my apartment. White rose with baby's breath to match what Sarah had mentioned for her bouquet. The florist, a kind woman named Helen, had pinned it to my lapel with extra care when I explained it was for my daughter's wedding. Walking toward the church, I felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified. This was my last chance to be part of Sarah's big day, my last opportunity to show her that despite everything that had gone wrong between us, I loved her more than my own life. The scene outside St. Mary's looked like something from a movie. Expensive cars dropping off guests in elegant clothes, photographers capturing candid moments of celebration, children in formal wear chasing each other across the perfectly manicured lawn. It was everything Sarah had dreamed of, everything she deserved. I spotted her through the stained glass windows of what must have been a bridal preparation room on the 2nd floor. Even from the street, even through colored glass, she was radiant. The vintage lace dress Dolores had mentioned in conversation with her friends transformed my daughter into something ethereal, a vision of beauty and happiness that made my chest ache with pride. Thomas stood near the church entrance, greeting guests, looking every inch the successful young businessman in his custom-tailored tuxedo. His family clustered around him, all of them radiating the kind of casual confidence that comes with never having to worry about money or social standing. I walked slowly toward the entrance, my boutonniere marking me as someone connected to the wedding party. A few guests nodded politely, assuming I belonged there. For a moment, I let myself imagine that I did belong, that I was just another proud family member arriving to celebrate Sarah's happiness. That fantasy shattered when Sarah spotted me through the window. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the shock and anger on her face. She disappeared from the window, and within minutes, she was rushing down the church steps, her vintage lace dress flowing behind her like something from a dream turned nightmare. "Dad," she said, and the word came out like an accusation. "What are you doing here?" The moment I'd been rehearsing for weeks arrived, and all my prepared words disappeared. Standing there in front of my daughter on her wedding day, seeing the genuine distress on her face, I realized that my presence wasn't a gift, it was a burden. "I came to see you get married," I said simply. "I'm your father." "Dad, you're not invited. Go away." The words hit me like physical blows. Around us, wedding guests had stopped their conversations, turning to watch the drama unfold on the church steps. I could see Dolores hurrying toward us, her face a mask of fury and satisfaction. Thomas stood frozen near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable, but doing nothing to intervene. "Sarah, please," I started to say, but she cut me off. "No, you can't just show up because you decide you want to be part of this. You weren't part of the planning, you weren't part of my life for the past 3 years, and you're not part of today." The silence that followed was absolute. Hundreds of people watching as my daughter publicly dismissed me from the most important day of her life. I looked at her beautiful face, saw the genuine anger there mixed with something that might have been embarrassment, and realized that I'd become an obstacle to her happiness rather than a source of it. Church security was already moving toward us, subtle but purposeful. Thomas's family was whispering among themselves, probably wondering what kind of family drama they'd married into. Sarah's friends from Northwestern were watching with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident. "Okay," I said quietly. "I understand." I turned and walked back toward my car, my boutonniere suddenly feeling like a costume accessory for a play I'd never been cast in. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of conversation, resuming the wedding day, returning to its planned perfection now that the unwelcome intruder had been removed. But I didn't drive away. Not immediately. Instead, I parked where I could see the church entrance and waited. Call it masochism or call it love, but I couldn't leave without witnessing some part of Sarah's wedding day. If I couldn't be inside celebrating with her, I could at least watch from afar as she found the happiness she deserved. The ceremony began at precisely 11 o'clock. Through the stained glass windows, I could see the shadow figures of the wedding party processing down the aisle. When the music swelled for Sarah's entrance, I rolled down my windows and listened to the organ music pour out of the church like a blessing. I couldn't see her walk down the aisle, couldn't watch her face as she said her vows, couldn't witness the moment she became Mrs. Thomas Vandenberg. But I could imagine it all, could picture her radiant smile and Thomas's proud expression and Dolores crying happy tears in the front pew. They were genuinely happy. From my car in the parking lot, watching the celebration I'd been excluded from, I could see that my daughter had found the life she wanted. And for the first time in years, that realization didn't fill me with sadness or anger or regret. It filled me with a kind of peace I hadn't expected. The 3-hour drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of small towns and farmland, my mind struggling to process what had happened. I'd gone to Sarah's wedding hoping for reconciliation, and instead received the clearest possible message that my role in her life was over. I stopped at a truck stop diner outside Millfield, one of those 24-hour places that caters to long-haul drivers and insomniacs. The waitress was a woman about my age named Norma, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her uniform wrinkled from a long shift. "Wedding or funeral?" she asked, nodding toward my formal attire as she poured coffee without being asked. "Wedding," I said. "My daughter's." "That's nice. You must be proud." I started to give her the polite response, but something about her kind eyes and the late-hour honesty of the empty diner made me tell the truth instead. "She didn't want me there," I said. Norma sat down across from me, something waitresses aren't supposed to do, but sometimes the rules matter less than human decency. "That's a hard thing," she said. "You want to talk about it?" So I did. I told her about 25 years of working multiple jobs, about sacrificing everything for a daughter who'd learned to see those sacrifices as abandonment. I told her about the divorce, the custody battle, the years of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who'd grown to resent my existence. "Sounds like you did the best you could with what you had," Norma said when I finished. "Sometimes that's not enough for other people, but it has to be enough for you. How do you make peace with losing your child?" She smiled sadly. "Same way you make peace with anything else. You decide that love isn't about getting something back. Sometimes love is about letting go. By the time I reached my apartment, it was nearly midnight. The laundromat was quiet for once, the weekend rush of washers and dryers finally silent. I climbed the narrow stairs to my door, my formal shoes echoing in the empty hallway like footsteps in a tomb. The breakdown came without warning. Standing in my tiny living room, still wearing the suit I'd bought for Sarah's wedding, I collapsed into the grief I'd been holding back for months. All the pain of watching my daughter drift away, all the frustration of working so hard for so little appreciation, all the loneliness of loving someone who no longer loved you back. I cried for the little girl who used to think I was a hero. I cried for the young father who'd believed that love and hard work were enough to guarantee happiness. I cried for all the moments I'd missed while working to pay for the moments I thought mattered more. When the tears finally stopped, I found myself looking through old photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Sarah at 3, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. Sarah at 8, serious and focused, playing piano in her first recital, while I beamed from the audience. Sarah at 12, rolling her eyes at something I'd said, but unable to hide her smile. Somewhere between those pictures and the woman who'd told me to go away, I'd lost her. Or maybe she'd lost me. Maybe the truth was that we'd both gotten lost, trying to find our way to a relationship that worked. The knock on my door came at 7 on Sunday morning. I opened it expecting to find my landlord, or maybe a neighbor complaining about noise, but instead found Margaret's sister Agnes standing in the hallway, holding a box of donuts and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I think we need to talk." Agnes had always been the quiet sister, the one who stayed in the background during family gatherings, who offered polite smiles but rarely opinions. Seeing her standing in my doorway was like seeing a ghost, unexpected and slightly unsettling. She sat at my tiny kitchen table and pushed the donuts toward me like a peace offering. "I was at the wedding yesterday," she said. "I saw what happened." I poured coffee and waited for her to continue, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I should have spoken up years ago," Agnes continued. "I should have told you what Margaret was doing, what she was saying to Sarah about you. But I was a coward, and now I'm watching my niece throw away the best father she'll ever have because she doesn't know the truth." The next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my failed marriage and my relationship with Sarah. Agnes told me about the systematic campaign Margaret had waged against me, starting almost from the moment Sarah was born. Every late night at work became Daddy choosing money over family. Every missed dinner became Daddy not caring enough to come home. Every sacrifice I made to provide for them, Hossam, became evidence that I was selfish and absent. Margaret had told Sarah that I'd refused to attend her school events, when the truth was I'd never been told about them. She'd said I was too busy to help with homework, when I'd actually offered every weekend and been turned down. She'd painted every generous gesture as manipulation and every act of love as inadequacy. "The college fund," Agnes said quietly. "Margaret told Sarah you'd gambled it away. She said you'd promised to pay for college and then spent the money on yourself." "I never gambled $1 in my life," I said. "I know. I tried to tell Sarah the truth once, but Margaret had already poisoned her mind. She believed her mother completely." The wedding exclusion hadn't been Sarah's idea, Agnes revealed. It had been Margaret's suggestion, presented as a way to avoid family drama on Sarah's special day. Margaret had convinced Sarah that my presence would somehow tarnish the ceremony, that I would embarrass her in front of Thomas's family. "She loves you," Agnes said before she left. "Sarah loves you, but she doesn't know who you really are anymore. Margaret made sure of that. 2 days later, my old friend Jim from the steel mill showed up at my door. Jim had worked alongside me for 15 years, had seen the exhaustion and the dedication, had watched me choose overtime shifts over bowling leagues and family barbecues. "Heard about the wedding," he said, settling into my couch like he belonged there. "Thought you might need some perspective." Jim reminded me of things I'd forgotten, stories from the mill that cast my choices in a different light. The time I'd worked a double shift to cover for a coworker whose wife was in the hospital, then donated my overtime pay to help with their medical bills. The Christmas when I'd given my holiday bonus to another worker whose kids wouldn't have gifts otherwise. "You were never the selfish bastard she made you out to be," Jim said. "Hell, most of us thought you worked too much for other people, not too little for your own family." That night, I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo Margaret's manipulation, or reclaim the years I'd lost with Sarah. But I could tell my story honestly, without anger or accusation, and trust that someday the truth would matter more than the lies. The letter took me 3 weeks to write. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it right. No accusations against Margaret. No self-pity about the sacrifices I'd made. No demands for apologies or reconciliation. Just the truth told simply and honestly with love. I wrote about the double shifts at the steel mill and what that money had paid for. Piano lessons, dance classes, private school tuition, her first car, 4 years at Northwestern University. I wrote about the weekend landscaping work that had funded her spring break trips and the pizza delivery job that had covered her graduate school applications. I wrote about the nights I'd stood in her doorway, watching her sleep, wondering if I was making the right choices, wondering if working so much was helping or hurting her. I wrote about the college fund Margaret had spent and the lies she'd told about where the money went. But mostly I wrote about love, about holding her as a newborn and promising her the world, about sitting in that aluminum boat at Lake Winnebago, listening to her dreams and believing they were more important than my own, about every sacrifice being a love letter I didn't know how to deliver. "I don't expect forgiveness," I wrote in closing. "I don't expect anything at all. But I wanted you to know the truth about your father, even if it doesn't change how you feel about him. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah, and watching you build a beautiful life makes every sacrifice worth it." I mailed the letter to her Chicago apartment and waited. No response came for weeks, then months. I told myself that was okay, that I'd said what I needed to say, whether or not she ever acknowledged it. Meanwhile, I was making changes in my own life. The depression that had consumed me after the wedding began lifting as I realized I'd spent 25 years defining myself entirely through my relationship with Sarah. I was more than just her father. I was a man who'd worked hard, who'd kept his promises, who'd tried to do right by the people he loved. The idea of leaving town had been growing for months. There was nothing keeping me in a place where every street corner held memories of failure. The steel mill was cutting jobs anyway, automation replacing the kind of manual labor that had defined my working life. I'd always loved the ocean, but had never lived near it. Oregon seemed like a place where a 58-year-old man could start over, where the sound of waves might drown out the sound of regret. The coastal town of Seaside was small enough to know everyone's name, but large enough to maintain privacy. I found work at a local hardware store helping weekend warriors and retirees with their home improvement projects. The pay was a fraction of what I'd made at the mill, but my needs were simple now. I rented a small cottage 3 blocks from the beach, close enough to hear the waves at night, but far enough inland to avoid the worst of the winter storms. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself rather than for someone else's dreams. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday in April, 6 months after I'd moved west. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a telemarketer or wrong number. The Chicago area code made me pause, but it was Sarah's voice that stopped my heart. "Dad," she said, and the word was different than it had been at the wedding. Softer, uncertain, maybe even hopeful. "Sarah, I got your letter. I need to talk to you." We talked for 3 hours, that first time both of us crying before the conversation ended. Sarah told me about her divorce from Thomas, finalized just 2 weeks earlier. She'd discovered his affairs, his gambling, his casual cruelty to people he considered beneath him. The prince she'd married had turned out to be something much darker. She'd been cleaning out her apartment, getting rid of everything that reminded her of her failed marriage, when she'd found my letter tucked away in a drawer. She'd read it again, really read it this time, and started questioning everything Margaret had told her about our relationship. "I called Aunt Agnes," Sarah said. "She told me things about Mom that I didn't want to believe. About the college fund, about the lies she told me about you." "Your mother was protecting you," I said, trying to be fair even now. "She thought I was a bad influence." "No, Dad. She was protecting herself from the guilt of breaking up our family for someone who could give her a better lifestyle." We made plans for Sarah to visit Oregon that summer. I spent weeks preparing for her arrival, wanting the cottage to be perfect, wanting to show her the life I'd built by the sea. I was nervous as a teenager on a first date, unsure if the woman who'd told me to go away was the same person who'd cried on the phone asking for another chance. She arrived on a foggy Saturday morning in July, driving a modest sedan that was nothing like the luxury cars she'd favored during her marriage. She looked older, more serious, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to go fishing with her daddy. We walked on the beach that first afternoon, not saying much, just getting used to being in the same space without anger or disappointment between us. The cottage was simple but comfortable, and Sarah seemed surprised by how peaceful everything felt. "I always pictured you living in that apartment above the laundromat," she said, angry and bitter about everything that went wrong. "I was angry and bitter," I admitted, "for a while. But anger is exhausting when you're the only one carrying it." We spent her visit talking honestly for the first time in years. Sarah told me about the loneliness of her marriage, about Thomas's family, treating her like a decorative accessory rather than a person. She told me about the pressure to maintain appearances, about the suffocating world of country club politics and social climbing. I told her about the years of working multiple jobs, about the exhaustion and the isolation and the gradual realization that I'd somehow lost the person I was trying to provide for. I told her about the wedding day, about sitting in the parking lot watching her happiness from afar. "I'm sorry," she said on her last evening as we watched the sunset from my tiny front porch. "I'm so sorry for everything." "You were a child," I said. "Children believe what their parents tell them. You had no way of knowing the truth. But I should have asked. I should have wondered why you were always working if you didn't care about us." "You know now," I said. "That's what matters." The healing wasn't instant or complete. Relationships damaged over decades don't repair themselves in a single weekend. But Sarah started calling regularly, started sharing details of her life that she'd kept private for years. She found a new job at a nonprofit organization, using her marketing skills to raise money for children's education programs. The work paid less than her corporate position, but gave her satisfaction she'd never found in the business world. She started visiting Oregon every few months, sometimes bringing friends who were surprised to discover that Sarah's father was nothing like the distant workaholic they'd heard about. We took long walks on the beach, cooked simple meals in my tiny kitchen, talked about everything and nothing, like we used to do on those fishing trips to Lake Winnebago. 2 years after our reconciliation, Sarah made a decision that surprised both of us. She moved to Portland, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to maintain her independence. She found work with a foundation that provided scholarships for first-generation college students, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs to make their dreams possible. "It's funny," she said during one of our Sunday dinners. "I spend all day working with kids whose fathers remind me of you. Men who work construction and drive trucks and clean office buildings at night so their children can have better lives. I used to think that kind of work was beneath us. Now I think it's the most noble thing in the world." Learning to be father and daughter again required patience from both of us. Sarah had to unlearn 25 years of believing I didn't care enough, and I had to stop protecting myself from the possibility of being hurt again. Trust rebuilt slowly, one honest conversation at a time. The real breakthrough came during Sarah's third visit, when she found the photo albums I'd saved from my old life. Pictures from her childhood that I'd never been able to throw away, memories of a little girl who'd loved her daddy before the world convinced her she shouldn't. "Look how happy we were," she said, studying a picture of us at the county fair, both of us grinning at the camera with cotton candy in our hair. "We can be happy again," I said. "Different, but happy." She was right. We could be happy again. Different from what we'd been, different from what either of us had imagined, but genuine in a way our relationship had never been during her childhood. The father and daughter who met regularly for coffee in Portland, who talked on the phone every Sunday evening, who'd learned to appreciate each other without the weight of expectations and disappointments between them. I kept working at the hardware store until I was 65, finding satisfaction in helping people fix things, in using my hands for creation rather than just survival. Sarah visited for my retirement party, charming my coworkers with stories about growing up with a father who could fix anything. "He taught me that love isn't just about being present," she told them. "Sometimes love is about being absent so the people you care about can have what they need." These days, I wake up to the sound of waves rather than washing machines. I tend a small garden behind the cottage, growing vegetables I actually have time to eat. Sarah calls every Sunday evening, and we talk about her work, my garden, the books we're reading, the places we'd like to visit together. Last month, she brought someone to meet me. David is a teacher at an inner-city school, a man who understands what it means to work for something bigger than yourself. They're talking about marriage, and this time I know I'll be invited to the wedding. "David wants to ask you something," Sarah said during their visit, and I knew what was coming. He's a good man, respectful and kind, clearly devoted to my daughter's happiness. When he asked for my blessing, I told him the truth. Sarah doesn't need my permission to be happy, but she has my blessing for whatever that's worth. The wedding is planned for next spring, a small ceremony on the beach near my cottage. Sarah wants me to walk her down the aisle, wants David's father to perform the ceremony since he's a minister. It will be everything her first wedding wasn't, intimate and genuine and filled with people who actually love her. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently 25 years ago. If I'd worked fewer hours, been present for more dinners, found some impossible balance between providing and participating. But that road leads nowhere useful. The choices I made were the best I knew how to make with the information I had. The father I was then did the best he could for the daughter he had then. The man I am now is grateful for the woman she's become, proud of her strength and her capacity for forgiveness, honored to be part of her life in whatever way she'll have me. Love isn't always enough to hold a family together. Sometimes circumstances and misunderstandings and other people's agendas can break bonds that seemed unbreakable. But love can be enough to build something new from the pieces, something different but real, something that acknowledges the past without being defined by it. I learned that a father's love doesn't end when his child stops returning it. It doesn't diminish when circumstances force impossible choices or when other people distort its meaning. Love persists, patient and quiet, waiting for truth to surface and trust to rebuild. Sarah and I lost 20 years to misunderstanding and manipulation, but we found each other again in honesty and grace. Not every story gets that kind of second chance, but ours did, and I'm grateful for every Sunday evening phone call, every shared meal, every moment of understanding that replaced the years of pain. The cottage by the sea has taught me something about twos. They go out, and they come in predictable but never quite the same. Love is like that too. It ebbs and flows, changes shape, adapts to new conditions. But like the ocean itself, love endures, patient and powerful, reshaping everything it touches. I tell people now that I have two daughters. The little girl I raised and lost, and the woman I found again. Both of them taught me something essential about what it means to be a father. The first taught me about sacrifice and devotion. The second taught me about forgiveness and hope. Together, they taught me that love is not a transaction where effort guarantees reward. Love is a commitment that persists regardless of circumstances. A choice to keep caring, even when caring, hurts a faith that truth and time can heal almost anything. Standing on the beach near my cottage, watching the waves come and go, I sometimes think about that young father who held his newborn daughter and promised her the world. I kept that promise in ways I never expected through sacrifice and loss and the long journey back to each other. The world I gave Sarah wasn't the one I thought she needed. It was something better. It was the knowledge that love persists, that family can be rebuilt on stronger foundations, that fathers and daughters can find their way back to each other, even after everything seems lost. That promise I made 25 years ago echoes still in every Sunday phone call, every visit, every moment of grace between us. I did give Sarah the world. I gave her a world where love endures, where truth matters, where second chances are possible for people brave enough to reach for them. And in the end, watching my daughter build a life filled with purpose and authentic love, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is not protection from pain, but proof that pain can be survived, that broken things can be mended, that love is strong enough to weather any storm. What started as a story about loss became a story about finding. What began with a father's heartbreak at a wedding became a daughter's invitation to walk her down the aisle toward real happiness. The man who once worked 4 jobs to provide for his family discovered that the most valuable thing he could give was simply showing up with honesty and patience and hope. Life taught us both that love is not about perfect presence or perfect provision. Love is about perfect persistence, the willingness to keep believing in each other even when everything seems lost. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very patient, that persistence pays off in ways more beautiful than anything you dared to dream. Have any of you experienced similar family challenges where misunderstandings created years of distance between you and someone you loved? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below about healing broken relationships or finding your way back to family after difficult times. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about love loss and second chances. And share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to rebuild what seemed permanently broken. Thank you for listening to my journey from heartbreak to healing. Remember that every family has its struggles, but with patience, honesty, and genuine love, Even the most damaged relationships can find their way back to something beautiful. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and never stop believing in the power of forgiveness.